All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our 8th session of the day. We've got Robert Muggah here joining us, and we are going to zoom out a little bit and look at cities and nations and how they are responding and can build some resiliency around events like pandemics and other kind of unpredictable things. So Robert has been around Singularity University for a little while now. He is a speaker, writer, and social entrepreneur on issues about security, cities, climate adaptation, and new technologies. He's the co-founder of the, how do I say this, Robert?
The IGAP Institute.
Founder of that place, an award-winning think and do tank working on data-driven safety and justice. He's also the co-founder of SecDev Group, which is devoted to disrupting digital risk and strengthening cybersecurity. He's worked in over 50 countries with the UN, the World Bank, governments, cities, and businesses. He's the author of 8 books, including Terra Incognita, which is about to come out sometime in 2020. He's a regular contributor to The Atlantic, BBC, CNN, Financial Times, Guardian, New York Times, Wired, and is a recurring TED Talk speaker in 2014, 17, and 19. So with that, Robert, thank you for joining us. I will hand it over to you.
Thanks so much for the invitation. And I'm going to share my screen if it's okay with you.
Absolutely.
Okay. Hopefully you can see it now. Well, it's obviously great to be with you and with everybody here today. I'm going to start my intervention with a health warning. And it's that if it's not already obvious, we're facing the most significant global threat to population health and political and economic stability in a generation. And that this is happening at a time of crisis in global governance when international cooperation and faith in national institutions is at a low point is alarming, to say the least. As previous speakers throughout this summit have stressed, in the short term, we obviously need to do everything we can to flatten the COVID-19 curve in the US and around the world. But we also have to reduce the panic, which is potentially more destructive than the disease. I think we, as is patently clear, have an extraordinary opportunity here for technology groups and cities to step up and play a more central role in the response. And while we're all focused squarely right now with dealing with the emergency, we should also be looking ahead to make sure we don't go to a back to a business as usual scenario when this comes to an end. If we've learned anything in the last 3 months, it's that a seismic systemic change needs to happen in how we deal with pandemics and other connected and complex risks. And I think Singularity can help, as can all of those who are listening right now. I want to do 3 things in my short intervention. First, I want to talk briefly about the spread of pandemics, including COVID-19. I then want to talk a little bit on why these pandemics are becoming more common. And finally, I'll offer a few ideas on how we, and particularly cities, might minimize pandemic threats now and into the future. And to do this, I'm going to be drawing a little bit on images from Earth Time, which is what you see in front of you right now. It's a data visualization managed by our partners at Carnegie Mellon's Create Lab in partnership with my institutes and others. What you see here is the total cumulative confirmed coronavirus infection spotted from late December until today. And we'll be adding scales and other indicators in the coming days. We literally just put this together. So let's talk a little bit about the frequency of pandemics. They are accelerating, and this is hardly a new finding. They've been speeding up over the last century. Ebola, SARS, H1N1, Zika, chikungunya, COVID-19, these are just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, in just the last few days, we've heard reports of a spike in fatal dengue fever cases all across Latin America, where I live, over 1,500 deaths and 1.3 million confirmed cases in the last year alone. And just this weekend, we heard about a new strain, or actually an old strain, but a new outbreak of avian influenza in a quail farm in the Philippines. And there are fears that H5N6, a highly dangerous and contagious virus, will be making a comeback. And this is just a typical weekend in virus land. These infectious outbreaks are more frequent than most people realize. You know, between 1980 and 2013, there were more than 12,000 documented disease outbreaks involving tens of millions of infected people. And while few of us ever hear about it, the World Health Organization detects about 7,000 signals of potential outbreaks every single month. In 2018, WHO detected outbreaks of 6 of the 8 priority diseases that they have on sort of red list at the same time. This is the first time that's ever happened. So we can't say that we weren't warned about COVID-19. Many people, including many who are part of the Singularity Network, have been shouting from the rooftops about the potential of catastrophic influenza pandemics for years. So all you have to do is go watch Bill Gates' 2015 TED Talk for as good an example as it gets. So when we get over COVID-19, and we will, these risks are not going to go away. And we have to avoid falling into that familiar cycle of crisis and neglect. Virologists believe that there are roughly 300,000 pathogens out there that could spread from animals to humans, and we simply don't know that much about them. Even if COVID-19 speeds up deglobalization, as many expect, these pandemics are not going away. Right now, you see Ebola on your screen. It was we dealt with that in 2014, a remarkable effort of physicians and doctors and local volunteers from across West Africa. But we only just ended a major outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo a few weeks ago that killed over 2,000 people and started in August 2018. We have to recognize that past success to contain infectious diseases are not always a guarantee that will prevent the next outbreak. These are a constant threat now and into the future. And I think if there's any message that comes out of this summit, it's that we have to be vigilant. It would be literally criminal not to set up a permanent global structure to deal with this in the future. And I'll return to that issue in a moment. So the human costs of pandemics are severe, and there's a reason why they're known as the first horsemen of the apocalypse. The bubonic plague from 540 to 750 killed up to 50%, half the world's population. The Black Death in the 1930s killed around 75 million people. The Spanish flu killed up to 50 million. H1N1 in 2009 killed about 250,000 people. That may be less than the previous outbreaks, but that's still 4 times more people than died in all the wars combined in that same year, 2009. We simply don't know how bad COVID-19 is going to be. CDC's worst case scenario that was essentially leaked is that 160 to 210 million Americans could contract the disease by December this year. 21 million of them could need hospitalization. And recall that we only have about 1 million beds in this country. And 200,000 to 1.7 million could die. Now that's just in the United States. Harvard researchers believe that 20 to 60% of the global population, that's 1.4 to 4.2 billion people, will be infected. Now with a conservative 1% case fatality rate, CFR, that translates into about 14 to 42 million deaths. It could be potentially much higher. That's a conservative estimate. So I'm working with a team right now of epidemiologists, of statisticians, of engineers, of computer scientists, and the numbers are slippery and hard to nail down. There's an enormous amount of uncertainty. We still don't really know the R-naught rates. We're still struggling with understanding the ranges and parameters for the CFR. We don't really understand the seasonality effects yet. And we still don't even know if you have immunity that you'll necessarily have a relapse or you'll recover, although some experiments suggest that this is not presenting itself in monkeys, for example. So just to give you a sense of the range, we see a CFR right now of about 0.2 in Germany and 5.7 case fatality rate, 5.7 in Iran. These are big variations, and much depends on the determinants of health and the existing characteristics of the population. So I'll leave the forecasting now to the experts at this summit and beyond. What we do know is the knock-on effects of COVID are going to be deep and long-lasting. The stock market is in, I'm sure all of you have noticed already, for a wild ride, and we can expect a range of short, medium, and long-term effects on the real economy. The severity of the impacts really depends on how long COVID-19 lasts before we have a vaccination, how it affects productivity, and the implications for the supply chain. About a decade ago, the Brookings Institution estimated that a mild pandemic could reduce global GDP by about 1%, while a significant one could shave off GDP by up to 12%. The World Bank just recently estimated that a Spanish flu type pandemic, which is kind of what we're looking at right now, could shave up to $4 trillion off global GDP. Some economists are beginning to think that might be an underestimate. So we're clearly facing the greatest threat to the global economy since the 2008 financial crash. And I think in the short to medium term, we can almost certainly see a recession. In fact, some are arguing that we're already effectively in one right now in the US, and the prospect of a global depression is real. So the implications of a significantly reduced economic growth for geopolitics, I don't need to tell anybody listening, are going to be profound. In the medium term, we can probably expect a speeding up of deglobalization, including around travel, trade, and tourism. But the consequences of an economic downturn on social and political disorder are also quite significant just about everywhere. As all of you know right now, there's a tremendous trust gap between elected leaders and citizens. People's faith in democracy around the world is at the lowest point in decades. And this is what you're seeing here is a study put together of a large number of countries by Cambridge University that came out just late last year, measuring faith in democracy and satisfaction or dissatisfaction in the case of this slide over the last decade to 2 decades. There's a growing frustration that's palatable with our politicians. And one problem in the US and the UK and other places is that people are receiving conflicting messages right now about COVID-19, and this is dangerous. Many people simply don't believe their elected authorities, much less their unelected ones, and are suspicious of the experts. Another big problem is that the supply and demand shocks are going to create massive hardship for people at the margins. What happens when people can't afford to buy bread, much less access to a private hospital for life-saving assistance? So some police forces are already preparing for this, as you might expect, but they're also worried that layoffs and sickness could lead to an upsurge in crime. Now, I study crime a fair bit, and what we do know for sure is that the combination of income and social inequality and rising unemployment are strong correlates for crime and victimization, both inside the home and outside the home. I think a hint of what's to come is in our prisons. We've already seen outbreaks of violence in Italian jails, and some countries are already beginning to release nonviolent offenders early to avoid this kind of catastrophe. And it's worth recalling that in the US, they have the largest prison population in the world, about 2.1 million people, followed by China, Brazil, and Russia. But it's not just real world threats that I'm concerned about, it's the digital ones as well. We have to watch out right now and into the future for a spike in opportunistic cyber attacks. In the last week alone, we've seen a big increase in misinformation campaigns and ransomware. Just this weekend, the US Health and Human Services Department suffered an attack on its computer system, presumably from a state-sponsored advanced actor group. There are also social media and SMS messages circulating right now about a national lockdown, something that the National Security Council here in the United States has obviously dismissed. As more and more people are going to be working from home, we can expect more and more ransomware attacks since people don't have the proper architecture and processes in place. This could get bad, and we need to be ready for it. So why are pandemics becoming more common? I think the gradual rise in pandemics isn't spontaneous. A few mega trends really stand out. I wrote a paper a couple of years ago that identified a few of them. One is globalization, which is the surging trade, travel, connectivity, which is bringing more and more people and the goods and the downsides of globalization together. Urbanization and high density living is a second. Environmental degradation, especially the loss of forest cover and reductions in biodiversity and the consumption of wild meat is a third. And climate change is a fourth, including warming temperatures and extreme weather events. And if these mega trends weren't worrying enough, we've also got the rise of superbugs and antimicrobial resistance, which is a huge and growing concern. Let me just focus on two of these mega trends. Turbo urbanization is going to speed up pandemic frequency and intensity. We know this. Right now, and many have heard this, 55 or give or take % of the world's population live in urban areas. This is going to rise to 70% by 2050. This translates into 2.5 billion people moving to cities in the next 30 years. That's 3 million people a week. So think about that for a second. Every hour, roughly 80 people are moving to New Delhi or to Lagos. And you can see some of that in the image here in terms of those bright spots and the concentration and dense clusters around Nigeria and India, for example. As our cities grow in number, size, and density, so will the number of outbreaks and people affected. So this isn't just about megacities, as mesmerizing as they are, with 10 million people or more. It's also about our large and medium and smaller cities where most people are actually moving. And it's not just about the city itself, but it's also about the peripheries, the transportation networks, and the supply chains that we have to think about. You see, many pandemics, they actually begin and thrive at the edge of cities and not in the center of them. In some cases, suburbs and slums are what are described as pandemic hubs. They're almost like super spreaders. And we saw this clearly here in New York City, where we have a suburb just in the north of New Rochelle in Westchester County, where we had the initial outbreak. The same thing happened in South Korea with the Shinshi Onji Church of Jesus, which is located in the southern city of Daegu. This means that we can't focus narrowly on securing physical or geographic borders in our so-called global cities. Prevention starts and protection starts far away from the downtown core and includes securing mobility corridors and supply chains, even in other countries. A second big megatrend is, of course, climate change, which is increasing our vulnerability to infectious diseases of many types. What you see here is average temperatures above the mean over more than 150 years. And rising temperatures and increasing rainfall are speeding up the movement of some disease vectors outside of their normal habitats. It's really, I think, too easy to say what the impact of changing weather is on, for example, COVID-19. But we do know the effects on other diseases. Think of how mosquitoes and ticks and rodents are appearing in new areas, often with new viruses. We've seen an exponential increase in breeding sites, certainly in parts of the world where I live, such as Rio de Janeiro. Extreme weather events also matter. El Nino in 2015, coupled with the Rio Olympics in 2016, allowed Zika to spread from Africa to Brazil and then across South America, as you would have seen in that earlier slide. But it's worth mentioning that the social and economic determinants of our cities will shape the spread and impact of our pandemics. You see, it's not just the size and the density of a city that matters, or its international networks. The characteristics of its population are also fundamental. Pandemic-related mortality rates are virtually always highest in communities exhibiting poor health and low economic status. These are not coincidentally the most poorly attended with health and other basic social services. And this is not a problem that's limited to informal settlements or shanty towns or slums in Africa or Asia or Latin America. At least 60% of adult Americans have a chronic health condition, be it heart disease or cancer or diabetes. Extraordinary, 60%. 40% of Americans have more than one chronic health condition. And as this map that you're seeing right now shows, about 1 in 8 Americans are below the poverty line. We're talking about over 40 million people. The extent of job security is also going to affect the nature of pandemics in our cities. Today, roughly 50% of the world works in the service sector, many of whom depend on direct human-to-human contact. Now, it's true that college-educated and gig economy workers are going to be able to telecommute, including many people listening right now. But what about Uber and taxi drivers? Amazon deliverers, restaurant and grocery retail clerks? People with the least job security are among the most at risk of COVID-19, yet they literally can't afford to be ill. So the terrible irony is that many of the people we depend on most are the most vulnerable. More than 75% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. And a few months off the job, we're talking pandemonium. Now, some companies are providing sick pay to those who self-isolate and who are infected, and that's important. But if governments don't step in, with private sector support, I think we'll see a rapid breakdown. The US is far from immune. So, what's to be done? Well, first, I think we have to accelerate global cooperation to deal with these mega threats. The scale of the challenges and the complexity and connectivity of our societies mean that we are all, by definition, in this together. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we're clearly suffering from a global leadership deficit. Right now, responsibilities are fragmented and spread across too many players. There's no unifying authority, and the WHO lacks the capacity and credibility to do more than what it already does. We need, I would argue, a G20 for pandemics, something that Jim O'Neill argued for in the Financial Times just recently. In normal circumstances, this would be led by the US, but these are not ordinary times, unfortunately. We need the US, EU, China, and other countries to step up and lead a major global effort. Now, it's heartening to see scientists and doctors collaborating around the world. The $100 million contributed by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the $50 million from the Wellcome Trust, the $7 million from the school are all hugely important. And so is the $12 billion from the World Bank and the $50 billion in credits made available by the International Monetary Fund. But we really need our national governments to step up. I admit that it's hard to see this happening at a time of resurgent nationalism and protectionism. And it's especially difficult to imagine this happening given that countries are facing massive crises of their own that they're currently dealing with. Country after country is going into lockdown, closing their borders. I mean, Canada and France just announced in the last few hours they'd be doing the same. But we need to accelerate global cooperation, not just in the next few months, but in the coming years and decades. Better cooperation also has co-benefits. Most obviously the case for action, which most obviously in the case for climate change as well. I honestly believe there's no alternative to collective action if we want to thrive, much less survive, in this century. And maybe this is something that Singularity can help out with. So we also need to see a strong, comprehensive, whole of society response backed by capable leadership. National and subnational governments and their health systems are obviously crucial to preventing and containing the spread of COVID-19. We can take inspiration from Singapore, Seoul, Hong Kong, and Taipei in terms of how they approach this virus. Singapore's foreign minister recently spoke of an era of test kit diplomacy that we're going to have to start engaging in. But with the exception of Singapore and perhaps China, national leadership on the COVID-19 response is still in desperately short supply. We need our global companies, especially our pharmaceutical and healthcare firms, to lead a surge and radically scale up support. The good news is that we have radically more distributed capacity now, as this map of the spread of randomized controlled trials around the world over the last 20, 30 years shows, than ever. But governments and business can't act alone. The whole population has to be part of a response. Each of us, especially those with the means, and this is a message that's been recurrent over and over, have to step up. We all have to be looking out for the most vulnerable, the elderly, the infirm, the disabled, those without the means around us. This all of society approach is something we've seen already in some Asian and European countries and cities. We've seen it also in times of war. And this is, I think, has been mentioned a number of times, such a moment. We're starting to see the first signs of this nationally here in the United States over the last couple of days. And it's potentially going to be strongest and most strongly expressed at the city scale. Third, we have to rapidly speed up intercity cooperation to improve detection and share best practices. Some of our national leaders, and unfortunately our more partisan news networks, deny the science or are politicizing a crisis. And we've still seen, despite declarations of emergency, inadequate support from our federal authorities to support states or provinces and cities. Yet it's cities, most obviously, that are on the front line of all this. They're often the first and the last line of defense. We have to harness the power of our mayors and our civic leaders and our civic entrepreneurs and our residents, including everyone listening right now. Mayoral networks can help with detection, with sharing information, with targeting communications, and rolling out effective response and treatment plans. And there's some good news in this front. I mean, many of you may have heard that last week, Michael Bloomberg announced a major mayoral response initiative in the US, specifically to provide virtual assistance to mayors, coaching to city planners, technical support in terms of how to roll out a pandemic response, accurate information in real time. So there's a real opportunity, I think, right now to scale these kinds of activities, not just in the United States, but globally, including in partnership with existing big intercity networks like the C40, say, or the UCLG, or the Global Parliament of Mayors, or many others that are out there. Fourth, cities need to invest urgently in better detection. Barring a major breakthrough, we won't see a vaccine within the next 6 to 12 months. I really hope I'm wrong on this, and I'll leave it to the scientists who are much more capable and informed on these issues than I. What this means is that we need to get better at surveillance, including of relapses, over the long term, possibly not just for months, but for years. Now, some countries are better prepared to do this than others, as this map of readiness, networked readiness from the World Economic Forum shows. The COVID-19 genome has already been sequenced 350 times since it was discovered. Remember, as been explained earlier, it experiences small mutations over time. And these sequences have been shared in GSAID, among other locations. The next best thing cities can do, other than administering a vaccination, is to rapidly identify who's infected as quickly as possible and isolate them appropriately. Testing can and has to be made free and rapid, in minutes and hours, not in days. And Daniel Kraft supplied some really hopeful and quite extraordinary examples here of how innovations are currently being developed, designed, and tested. What we need urgently are point-of-care diagnostics for frontline responders. This is a call that I'm hearing from cities around the world, especially cities in the so-called global south, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. A major push is required to get testing kits into cities and their peripheries where people actually live. And special attention is required to reach the most vulnerable and low-income communities, especially the poor, migrants, and minorities. So we have the tech potential for detection, triage, ultrasound, and all of the rest. What we need to do now is rapidly find ways to scale it. Now, my own organization is working with other groups who are building apps to try to non-intrusively encourage super spreaders to self-identify and isolate. We're exploring how to use multiple sources of data from social and conventional media and other signals to improve detection in data-scarce environments. Obviously, there are many, many others who are innovating in exciting ways. Tech does have a role here to play, but we have to be mindful of the way, I think has been cautioned before, about how this can also affect privacy, civic liberties, and human rights. Something I think that Divya covered very elegantly. The fifth thing we have to do is flatten the curve. Cities also have to be supported to adopt the right non-pharmaceutical interventions. There is, and you've seen this graph many times, and there's a good reason for that, an evidence-based package of interventions that can flatten the curve. And many city authorities know what works and are applying the right strategies. But there are others that are not. What is needed, and this is the recipe across all cities, is early, sustained, and layered interventions. Now, these have worked since the 1918 Spanish flu, if not well before. And they typically involve three basic measures: banning public gatherings and setting strong limits and enforcing them, closing public and private schools, but keeping services available for those who require them. Here in New York, for example, where I'm currently staying, there are 114,000 homeless kids in this city alone who depend on food provided by schools. So ensuring that balance is critical. And number three, isolating ill people in quarantine of suspected illness. This is basic and hard to do, but it's essential. And we need to get that message out. And CDC is doing an admirable job of doing that here in the United States. But we can do a lot more in terms of accelerating that knowledge transfer, especially to cities in low and income settings, which are really still not in the news and where we're going to see the next series of waves hitting hard. Sixth, looking ahead, we need to also think about the redesign of our cities to minimize pandemic outbreaks in the future. Obviously, our priority right now has to be on prevention, containment, and treatment, as it should be. But looking into the not so distant future, we need to make some really big changes to how we're designing the physical and social and digital layout of many of the places where we live, including potentially deconcentrating certain forms of population density, but also reducing inequality in our cities. No matter how high the gates or how thick the bunker walls, no one is going to be able to hide for long from a disease pandemic. I think we could be doing a lot more in terms of cellular thinking, promoting more hyper-local resilience, self-sufficiency, regeneration in our cities, in urban planning and design. And this applies for everything from the way that cities surge to attack pandemics, think about white blood cells in the body, to stimulating local food production in neighborhoods, think about vertical gardens here, ensuring city laws and procurement maximize self-sufficiency and adaptability. So there are a lot of things we can do, I think, to get our cities more cellular. And it will require upgrading, retrofitting, and repurposing our cities for pandemics, but also for climate change. I mean, it's obvious. If there is an existential threat, that's the other one. This will be especially urgent, though, not just in the US and Europe, but in Africa and Asia, where 90% of all future population growth is set to take place. Singularity could start a work stream on that today. Finally, we need to think about pandemic preparedness beyond the geographic footprint of our cities. Preventing and responding to and eliminating pandemics shouldn't be confined to the physical territory of the city. It requires thinking not just about the city, but about its suburbs, its peripheries, its poorest populations, and wider transportation and supply chain networks. Understanding our cities as having physical, social, economic, digital, and extraterritorial dimensions can help us improve population health, safety, inclusion, and well-being in the long term. It also helps us anticipate external threats well in advance. One way to help move this along might be to be thinking about building a real-time urban pandemics preparedness index to track city vulnerability and resilience. And some people are thinking about that, including folks at Georgetown University and others here in the States and around the world. So here's my punchline. COVID-19 is gonna be hugely disruptive, at least for the next year and possibly for longer. But we can expect more pandemics, even if this were to be addressed rapidly. Cities are at the forefront of that response, and they can benefit from pooling resources as well as thinking now about redesign. And the investments in our cities getting retrofitted, I firmly believe, to this new reality are trivial compared to the alternative. It's a big agenda, and we're going to need all the exponential action we can muster to deliver on it. Thanks.
Oh, just kidding. I was muted. Thank you for that, Robert. Let's try this again, everybody. I really, really enjoyed all the charts and graphs, especially the animations. Super, super cool. I know we have lots of people that are asking how they might be able to get a copy or a link to what you shared. So we'll follow up and see what we can figure out there. But if you have a couple extra minutes, I'd love to get into some Q&A that have come in from our audience.
Sure.
All right. And of course, if any of these don't feel like you're the best suited person to answer them, we can always defer them to later.
Right.
Anna's got the first question. She's curious what you think new types of economies might look like based on where we're heading. I think is the best way that I can, like, what do you think will happen with our current economic system, and will it change and evolve based on COVID-19?
It's really hard to say right now, isn't it? I mean, I think it goes back to what I was saying about how long this thing lasts, whether or not we see a vaccination, and whether our decision makers and our business leaders and all of us decide that we want the status quo or not. My feeling is that we are headed into, I mean, the bankers right now are suggesting that we're probably going to see a short V curve and a return back to normality sometime, into later this year, perhaps after summer, into the North American, Western European autumn and winter. I find it very hard to believe that that's going to be possible, given what we know now about not just the impacts on stocks, but also on the real economy, impacts on supply chains up and down the system, especially, but also on small and medium-sized enterprises that won't have the liquidity to be able to keep running and manage this kind of storm. And I think, obviously we're in an election year here in the United States, so this government will throw everything it can at this problem, and it's an existential issue for China, so it's going to do the same. But in many other countries that don't have that kind of a capability, I think we're going to see some really serious damage to the real economy. So it's hard to say, and I think the question is, how do we return? I think in the short term, what we're already seeing are movements around the world towards more of a circular and regenerative economies, a lot more investment in cryptocurrencies and new forms of barter systems. This has already become kind of trendy, certainly in some of the sort of major capitals of Europe as well as in the United States. So I think this could hasten that trend as people think about alternate ways of exchange and ultimate forms of digital exchange, especially given the kind of distancing that's going to happen moving forward. But I think it's really difficult to make that call right now. And I think what I would say is now is the moment. As we think about and we are seized by the panic of the current moment, and we need to look after our loved ones and our neighbors and our communities, and that should be where our focus is. I think at the same time, now is the moment to be rethinking and reimagining what those new economies look like and finding ways of coming up with alternate narratives to the current one, which is too freighted with risk, I think, to be sustainable.
Appreciate that. I think that's a good one. Let me try to find this other question that came up. Was about, oh, maybe it went away. Well, in that case, I'll pick a different one. Question about how do you think populations like Germany and Italy get such a rapid, have seen such a rapid and widespread spread of the virus as compared to other developed countries? what's made some of these maybe the first world economies more susceptible than others so far?
Well, part of it could be the hubs and transportation, that you have a much higher volume of movement of people through air traffic, and so the earlier movements may have been more rapid. Part of it, you also have centers of learning in universities, and there's an enormous population of people moving from infected areas to other areas that coincided with Chinese Lunar New Year and movements of a big churn of the populations back to different schools across North America and Western Europe. But I honestly think that a big issue, we should be seeing a lot more, I think, in some of these economies, certainly in Africa, where you have a very large Chinese presence, as well as in parts of Asia, where you have high, densely compact populations. So I think it really probably comes down to the ability of many of these countries to introduce detection. It comes down to their ability to manage that information flow and ensure that it's made public as quickly as possible. I suspect what we're seeing right now is a major underreporting in many of these other large economies where we're not seeing a lot of numbers. That doesn't say that there aren't capabilities or latent and real capabilities to manage pandemics. I think, many countries in West Africa, for example, having dealt with Ebola, come out the other side, actually have some quite robust and sophisticated mechanisms to deal and detect with pandemic stress. They're certainly faster at detecting cases in Senegal and Nigeria than they are in the United States. However, the underlying social and economic determinants of those populations are much more vulnerable than many of those in the so-called wealthier world, or the rich world. And so I think what we're going to probably see as testing becomes more widespread is a radically different numbers moving forward. Got
it. Thank you for that one. All right, the next one that's at the top is, I think, first a question, depending on your answer, another question. Are you familiar with the concept of herd immunity?
Yeah, it's been sort of discussed widely, hasn't it?
It has, and it's been. I don't think we've had a chance to answer it yet, but Megan asks, it's been a lot of the buzz here in Sweden. There have been no talks of lockdown. Schools are still open, offices are still open, no testing's being done unless somebody's in critical condition. Same in the UK. What are some possible outcomes from that approach that you might be aware of?
There have been a number of articles coming out in the last couple of days, and expert opinion that's been weighing in on this. And I'm not an epidemiologist by training, so I'm wary of wading in to this topic when you've got many more capable people to speak about it. But I do know that the UK and a few other countries appear to be rolling out this experiment, as it were, in testing, trialing herd immunity. The sort of conventional view that I've been reading suggests that this is potentially quite dangerous, that it's a bit of a throw of the dice in the absence of understanding the level of relapse or immunity, frankly, and then subsequently to relapse to coronavirus, to COVID-19. And without sort of proper management and communications and transparency and some direction around introducing policies to try to stimulate this, it could have potentially quite disastrous outcomes. And I understand the costs of a hard containment strategy, like what we're seeing, for example, in Italy or Spain or now in France, is potentially higher in the short term because of the shutdown, evidently, to the local economy. There seems to be a little bit more, let's call it evidence, over centuries to that strategy as opposed to the herd immunity view. So I'm a little bit nervous. I'm a lot nervous about the strategy that has yet to have been thoroughly tested. But again, I would defer to the epidemiologists on this particular question.
Fair enough. There's an interesting question that comes in from Miguel, who asks, what are the key items in a family or personal resilience plan to prepare for future pandemics?
Yeah, well, it depends how much risk you're prepared to absorb. And I guess it also depends a little bit on the nature of the pandemic. I think this idea of not panicking, I think is important, thinking coolly and clearly, putting in place a set of strategies that allows you to be able to adjust your own psychology to the situation, I think is really important. So The first thing I would say is have a plan, and have a plan B, and have a plan C, so that you yourself are able to anticipate sort of the moves that you might make at different points, and it's adjusted to your own risk threshold, and of course the evidence that's been made available, and the wise practices that are hopefully being disseminated by your public health systems. I think communicating that plan and having a network around which you're communicating routinely and regularly is important as well, so that people are able to keep track of you and you're able to keep track of them, especially your loved ones. I think that's going to be one of the biggest, most painful outcomes of this particular pandemic, is that people are going to have very close family members suffering greatly, and the temptation to spend time and be there is going to be irresistible. And yet, what we understand is that actually can act to further contribute to more contamination and endanger you and your family. So having a plan with regular communication, I think is going to be really important. Thinking through your finances, obviously spend your time to go through your portfolio, communicate that with your family so that you're not stressed out constantly about, your financial situation is going to be critical. I think a lot of people are running for the hills right now, and if they can afford it, they're running for their islands, or whatever it is that they have. I think that one of the dangers here, I appreciate that people are looking after their personal safety, but this is going to reach everywhere. And so I think now is the time to really double down on trying to strengthen the community resilient structures that you've got in your neighborhoods, supporting those who don't have the means to support themselves, who are living paycheck to paycheck, finding ways to contribute either of your time or of resources, I think is probably one of the most important strategies, both to give meaning to the moment, but also to reinforce and strengthen the resilience of your community. I think, of course, every situation will be different, and it's hard for us to prejudge how people will make their choices. The other thing I would say is have a good, adequate information stream coming your way about the nature of the crisis. I think there's a temptation to perhaps spend your entire time on Twitter watching every number, and I've certainly been guilty of that the last couple of months, but I'm crunching numbers right now. I think that too much information can lead to overload, paralysis, exhaustion. And then the final thing I think is it's been the message of the summit, which is look after yourself. You have to look after your sleep, you have to look after your immunity, you have to look after that of your family. The old logic applies that your weakest link is the one that will bring down the system. So it's important that you're looking after your own health throughout all of this. Because if you do fall ill, well, then you're in a whole other place. And having a plan, I think, for those of people who have children and families, I think one of the concerns many parents have is what happens if both parents fall ill. Having a bit of a strategy within your networks to manage that eventuality or possibility, I think, is also critical for one's own peace of mind.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff to think about there, for sure. All right, I will. We might have time for two more questions. I'm going to go take us back at the city level. Are there any cities that you can call out that you think are responding particularly well to COVID-19?
Yeah,
and what can we learn from them?
Well, I'm sure there are definitely many. It's still quite early days, but I think there's one chart that many people have seen, which shows the trajectory of COVID-19 in European and North American countries, and on a logarithmic scale, and shows the less, let's call it, exponential trends in a number of countries and cities at the same time. And Japan, Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taipei, and Taiwan, obviously, some cities in China have managed really to lower the curve, as it were, to reduce that spread. And there are a number of lessons there, some of which can be applied, I think, to democratic countries, perhaps, and some of which are perhaps less easy to apply. But I think the number one lesson is act early. Understand that it's coming. Understand that you've got a number of incubation cycles. Pre-deploy your assets and resources, but act quickly to prepare your health capabilities to call up those docs that maybe have been retired or they're off work, to bring in those extra nurses and healthcare workers, to prepare the assets that are required for the crush that could be coming. Number two, it's detection. Many of these cities in these countries, Singapore being a city-state, but also Taipei and Hong Kong to a lesser extent, and some, Seoul to some extent, although Seoul, Korea is dealing with its own drama. we're exceptionally good at early detection and understanding the extent. No one really knows the full denominator of this, but they're getting better at least of understanding what some of the numerators look like. The other thing I think is transparency, openness, and communication. Ironic in some of these countries, perhaps, but have been perhaps more transparent and open, having learned the lessons of avian flu and SARS and H1N1. And so being open and communicative and explaining to the public what's going on, because nothing breeds anxiety, insecurity, and unrest like uncertainty, has been critical. And so having those lines of communication, this is where it gets a little tricky. Good interagency cooperation. So between the feds, the state, and the city. Singapore is, in a way, easy at one level. I don't want to minimize the skill because they are really the gold standard on dealing with pandemics, but interagency cooperation is critical. Unfortunately, in some parts of the world, notably in the United States, but not uniquely, there are some tensions between the feds, the states, and cities. And this has been there even before the current administration. And so managing that interagency coordination, ensuring that there are lines of communication and clarity over who does what, is really critical because you've got to move fast on this and you have to reduce those transaction costs and frictions wherever you can. But I think those are some lessons, or many others, obviously.
Yeah, for sure. We'll have to do a follow-up piece with you as this develops and there's more lessons learned. I think that there's something
absolutely. One point to that, it's really important that we get those lessons learned out there because some of this is really obvious. I think many people listening will say this is, of course you have to do these things, but actually there are many cities right now in the world that don't have this set of prescriptions on how do you declare an emergency? How do you close your schools? What's the first thing you should do in terms of detection? How do you set up reserve hospitals, auxiliary capacity? What are the networks we should do? How do you communicate to your public? All these things which should be straightforward are not always evident. And one thing I'll say, the US Conference of Mayors and the National League for Cities have been exemplary, together with the CDC, in making that kind of information available to their thousands of cities across the United States. And so that having those kinds of networks in place and using those and feeding cities with the right kind of information is incredibly handy. So I commend those two networks and hope that others follow suit.
Yeah, it's a really good example. Well, Robert, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time to talk about the role that cities play and how we can think about and what we can learn and then apply towards the future. So thank you for being here. I've got a link to your slides that I'll share with everybody shortly. Anything you want to say before you head out?
No, obviously, if people have questions or concerns or anxieties, please follow up. You can make my email available. And happy to be connecting with folks on this. And obviously hope that everybody looks inward and supports their cities and their neighborhoods in this particular moment. This is the moment to do that. And your city needs you and you need your city. So.
Wonderful. Thanks for being here, man.
Thank you.
See ya.
See ya.
All right. And that wraps up Robert's session. So we've got two more. We're going to be talking about leadership, and then you're going to hear from a startup that is in the middle of innovating relatively quickly to respond to this crisis. But first, as we've got into the habit of doing, let me just share some of the links so that you can get what you've been asking for in the comments. There we go. All right. First, if you were looking for Robert's slides, here is another bit.ly link. This one's a little bit longer, but it's right here and it should work. So I'll give you some time to copy that down if you want to go and get the slides. And remember, if you don't get it while this is up, you can always go back and watch the replay and grab it, which is my second point that you'll notice up there. We're also trying to do our best to answer all the questions. If we can't, we will be answering them as we can over the coming days, weeks, and months beyond. So continue to come back and check in. We'll share those out as we can. Also continue to engage with us on social at SingularityU. Use the hashtag, and that's a good way for us to see where you've got a question and try to go and respond if we weren't able to get to it in the session today. Mentioned last time, we've got the Facebook group set up. We had our first experiment, the WhatsApp group that went really, really well. And now I think people are over on Facebook starting to connect and engage with each other. And if you don't have Facebook, go to our website, su.org. We've got live chat on there. We'll figure out a way to get you plugged into what's going on. And of course, the Be Innovative platform, we're crowdsourcing ideas for what to do coming out of the summit, and we'd love for you to get involved. Lastly, I know that a lot of you were asking about what can I do in my city, or what can my company do, or how do I get involved? What's going on here? You want to play an active role. If it's not clear how to get plugged in on su.org, you can always email us at info@su.org. Tell us what you're trying to figure out. We are happy to make connections and kind of guide you through our ecosystem to get up and running. So with that, I'm going to drop off, and we will see you in the next session with Ellie talking about leadership in times of global crises like these. So I'll see you shortly.